Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi, here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thade with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, January 20th, 2024. We commence with our ancestor, Didan Kamati, in the African drumbeat historical calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Elisabeth B. Armstrong, Professor of the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College, and author of the book, Bury the Corpse of Colonialism, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Anne Pollock, Professor in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College in London, and author of the book, Sickening, Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. We will also hear prison radio commentaries from Umia Abu-Jamal and our sister Crystal Clark, who needs help. We also want to remind our listeners that there is a global strike this week, calling for a ceasefire now in Palestine, starting tomorrow, January 21st through the 28th. It is a justice against injustice and a good against evil. It is a war against humanity in the world, not just against Gaza. Join in solidarity with the global strike, January 21st through the 28th. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Alice Coltrane, Larry Willis, Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, Mulgrew Miller, Earl Klugh, Mr. Capone, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand, ready for revolution.
Maweni Ikai, this is Brother Didan Kamathi with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of January 26. We present this calendar to put into context the present struggle against the three evil paradigms of oppression: national oppression, which many call racism; class oppression, which many call poverty; and gender oppression, which many call sexism. It is through reviewing the history of our struggles we gain added momentum in the ideological wars against the three evil pillars of capitalism and imperialism. January 26, 1895, Rosa Castellanos La Balla Mesa. She was a fighter in the Cuban 10-Year War and the War of Independence. She was a captain and herbologist. She treated the wounded and founded the first hospital. January 26, 1944. African-born and a U.S. revolutionary, Angela Davis is born. She's a scholar, activist on race, gender, and prison reform. She is a PhD in philosophy who committed herself to black liberation and socialism. January 27, 2002. Wasfiya Idris, the first known Palestinian woman to sacrifice her life as a suicide bomber in Israel in protest of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Idris grew up in the Al-Amari refugee camp on the West Bank, which was constantly subject to Zionist raids and violence. Only days before she detonated the bomb that killed her, she tended to a 15-year-old boy shot in the head by the Israeli army, who later died of injuries. January 28, 1863. Ya Asatiwa, legendary Ashanti national heroine of Ghana. When the British colonizers seized the golden stool, the Ashanti's most sacred object and symbol of the nation, the male chiefs vacillated about going to war. Ya Asatiwa, at the age of 50, led the women to fight against a superior armed British army. In March 28, 1900, the Ashantis were defeated and placed under British control on January 1, 1902, and Ya Asatiwa was sent into prison on the Seychelles Island. January 30, 1865. Dat Tesi. She was an Apache Native American warrior from the matriarchal Apache society. She was raised with great skills as a warrior, hunter, scout, and diplomat of Geronimo. January 31st, 1901. Francine Bernard, an Azanian warrior queen, was born. She was a leader of the African National Congress, the leading liberation movement in the struggle against apartheid. She was a trade unionist, domestic worker, and trade union leader, and is considered the Fanny Hamer of Azania, South Africa. She led the Pass Laws Revolt and was imprisoned and eventually banned from South Africa in 1969. January 13, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution to abolish chattel slavery was passed. February 1st, 1960. 4 African students initiated the second phase of the civil rights movement with the student sit-ins at the Woolworth department store in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. The students attempted to order a hamburger and were beaten and jailed by the whites for challenging the segregation laws. The following day, 23 brothers from A&T and 4 sisters from Benedict College returned to the department store facing the same punishment. Before the end of the semester, over 6,000 students from over 78 southern campuses, primarily African colleges, had sat in, and over 2,000 had not only gone to jail, but were brutally beaten and tortured by the racist southern police. Within 1 year, over 70,000 young people, mainly Africans, staged sit-ins throughout the South. February 1st, 1898, Queen Mother Moore, an African sister activist in the U.S. was born. She was an early organizer of Garber's Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Later in 1933, she joined the Communist Party USA due to its program of supporting the establishment of a black nation in the 5 state areas of the South. She was a prolific organizer of domestic workers, tenants, and women in Harlem. She was a founding member of the National Council of Negro Women, Universal Association of Ethiopian Women. In 1962, she formed the Reparation Committee of Descendants of U.S. Slaves. She passed away at the age of 98. This has been Brother D. Don with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. In the language of the struggle of our peoples, please join us in saying Amandla Awaitu, which means the power belongs to we the people.
Amandla
Awaitu.
Amandla
Awaitu.
Amandla
Awaitu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Elisabeth B. Armstrong, Professor of the Study of Women and Gender at Smith College in Massachusetts, and author of the book Bury the Corpse of Colonialism, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Professor Armstrong.
Thank you so much for having me, Gerald. This is a huge honor.
And it's an honor to have you. So why did you write this book?
I wrote it because I discovered a conference as I was doing work on another project, and I had never heard of it before. So I was working on a project on the left women's movement in India, the All India Democratic Women's Association, and I was looking for their anti-colonial roots. I could see in the movement that was ongoing and vibrant and active in India today had its roots in anti-colonialism, and I was curious about that. And as I started doing archival research in New Delhi, I discovered there was this organization called Women's International Democratic Federation. While I was thinking about that and discovering how many people who were part of the movement I was studying in India had gone to conferences either in Copenhagen in 1953 or in other conferences such as the one in Paris in 1945. In that process, I discovered there was an Asian women's conference that, rather than being more nationalist in scope, as some of the conferences at this time were, but really quite explicitly a revolutionary Asian and African women's conference. That was the moment I became very curious, because I had heard nothing about this conference, even though it was so integral to the movement I was working on my current project at that time on.
Mm-hmm. So who was Celestine Coulibaly of what is now called Burkina Faso?
Yes, so Celestine Coulibaly was a very well-known activist in Burkina Faso. At the time when she started, she was moving between Côte d'Ivoire as well as what was then Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso. And she was intimately involved in the liberation movements in West Africa. And at that time, they had not yet committed to a nationalist program. They very much were a Pan-Africanist articulation of the possibility of freedom, the possibility of independence. And she was one of the leading women from, I imagine it was earlier than 1945, but her name starts to emerge in 1945. All of these formations, because of the way histories are written, archives are captured, the European designated dates, those sort of turning point dates. So 1945, obviously the end of what we call World War II, but not the end of war, not at all. So the starvation that had been faced in Western Africa, that was a planned starvation, a starvation to feed troops on the European front, inspired movements not only in West Africa and North Africa, but also in South Asia, in East Asia, as they saw a planned starvation, a choice in a moment of war to feed the white European, white Euro-American soldiers over the populations who were actually growing that food. So she was part of this upsurge that truly was a global upsurge in this mid-1940s period. But her name starts to appear by 1945, 1946.
So who was Eslanda Robeson, and what role does she play in your book?
Eslanda Robeson plays an absolutely critical role in this book, in this storytelling. So she was a well-known activist. She had been part of the Scottsboro trials when, during the 1930s, she was a storied organizer in Harlem, in New York City. She had a very famous partner, Paul Robeson. She herself had been touring in 1944 part across Africa. And part of what she records in her diaries is this anti-colonial movement at a time when it was definitely part of the world organizing, but it hadn't yet congealed in a way that was apparent to others. So she was someone who was a journalist. She was on the Council of African Affairs. She was a deep, true internationalist, a Pan-Africanist. And she was someone who, thankfully, for someone who comes so much after the fact, she left this incredible set of diaries. So she was a journalist and she was taking notes in that regard, but she was also just an incredible human being. And so she'll record, she has records of who she met and how they made her feel and the conversations they had and the connections that she made. So Eslanda Robeson had joined a meeting in Moscow, held directly before this Asian Women's Conference in Beijing, and she traveled on the train together with many, many of the delegates that attended this conference. And luckily, her diaries held this incredible record of the conversations they had, the jokes they shared, the games that they played, as well as the really deep political conversations that they had together.
Now, some in our audience might be familiar with Charlotta Bass. She was a publisher of the California Eagle based in Los Angeles and was also a political activist of some repute. What role does she play in your story?
She unfortunately plays a small part in this particular story at the Asian Women's Conference because the U.S. government at this time, so the conference is held at the end of 1949, but they were already denying visas. And Charlotta Bass was absolutely planning to attend this conference. She applied for a visa from the U.S. government, and they said, there's no way you're going. So I would say that's an honor in a sense. Her repute as an organizer, the knowledge of her reach was apparent to the U.S. government. And they said, no, we can't allow you to go. This is too dangerous for the interests, their anti-communist interests at that time.
So what about Claudia Jones? Who was she and what role does she play in your book?
Claudia Jones is another luminary. She's somebody that we really can't imagine these movements. Whether or not Charlotta Bass was able to come, there's a way that she was already there. And I'd say the same is true with Claudia Jones, who also faced the wrath of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know. She was one of the people who pulled the lessons from this conference. She wrote extensively after this conference ended. She was right on the cusp. One of the things that was announced by the North Korean delegate to this conference was the impending war. They could see the writing on the wall, and they said, get ready to write those women's voices for peace, because this will be an imperialist war in Korea, and we need all Americans to write against this war. And Claudia Jones was right there. And she herself attributes her forced leaving of the United States by the United States government because of an International Women's Day speech that she wrote condemning the Korean War. So there's a way that Charlotta Bass and Claudia Jones weren't physically present at this conference, but they were absolutely there in spirit, and they carried its message of internationalism and anti-colonialism and anti-racism around the world.
What about Ada Jackson? Who is she and what role does she play in your book?
Ada Jackson is another phenomenal organizer. And I think unlike maybe Charlotta Bass and Claudia Jones and Eslanda Robeson, Ada Jackson didn't have the same national reach of her name. But if you look into her organizing in Brooklyn, New York, which is where she was from, she was one of those people that everybody knew. She was on every local committee. She was on the PTO. She was the representative of her district. She was in electoral politics. She ran for office. She was in all kinds of civic groups. And she was also a committed internationalist. And I think there's a way that Ada Jackson instantiates, kind of imagines and allows us to remember that the local is always part of the international.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Elisabeth B. Armstrong, professor of the study of women and gender at Smith College in Massachusetts and author of the book, Bury the Corpse of Colonialism, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. Your employer, Smith College, is notorious for holding archives on women. What untapped archives on Black women do you espy at Smith College?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is a really fantastic archive. It was started, let's say, how would you say, under a cloud, but a cloud, an honorable cloud. It was always there to keep the records of left women organizers, of Black and brown women organizers, anti-racist organizers. I mean, it didn't always, for a long time, it had to almost function secretly or semi-secretly just to keep its holdings together. I think there's a ton of records. Of course, we hold the records of Loretta Ross, who's a well-known activist today, but there's a whole range of Black women's reproductive justice archives that we hold and care for and care about. We also hold, there's sort of an unsung, brilliant and thoughtful organizer, Vicki Garvin, who did her MA in economics, and I'm pretty sure it was a radical economics MA at that. I've had the opportunity to read her MA thesis, and it was around organizing domestic workers and home health care workers. So there's a whole range from I would say the early 20th century right through to the current day. And we continue to, because of the sort of company that these archives keep, we continue to have the opportunity to hold particularly Black women's activist records in the holdings. So it changes. In fact, I just got an email the other day about another set of materials that are coming into the archive. So I would suggest to your listeners to go onto the archives website, Sophia Smith Archives, and see what's been digitized. That's our next project, is to make sure that they're as open as possible, so as many people can plumb the depths of their records and the lessons they hold.
Well, it's interesting. I actually knew Vicki Garvin, who, of course, spent years in Ghana during the regime of Kwame Nkrumah, and then after he was overthrown, she spent years in China. I met her in her later years when she was living in Queens, New York, with many stories to share and tell. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there. Professor Armstrong, professor of the study of women and gender at Smith College in Massachusetts, and author of the book Bury the Corpse of Colonialism, the Revolutionary Feminist Conference of 1949. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. And I'm very envious of your knowledge of Vicki Garvin, and I would love to hear those stories another time.
Oh, sure, no problem. For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne. Hold the date, Saturday, February 3rd from 1 to 3 p.m., a launch of my latest books, Acknowledging Radical Histories and I Dare Say a Gerald Horne Reader. Find further details at kpfk.org or my Facebook page. All, and I do mean all, proceeds going to your favorite radio station, KPFK. However, in addition to these books, also available will be other books. For example, if you are a worker in Hollywood, a makeup artist, an actor, a director, a screenwriter, a cinematographer, a carpenter, an electrician, a truck driver, or simply someone seeking to understand this anchor of the Southland economy, available will also be my book, Class Struggle in Hollywood, 1930 to 1950. Moguls, mobsters, stars, Reds and trades unionists. It will be available for inscription to your favorite loved one or for donations to a school library. And I might also add that if you're trying to understand the implications of the 2023 strike or what's in store for this industry going forward in 2024, you must read this book. Speaking of screenwriters, a book of mine that awaits a talented screenwriter or adapter is The Color of Fascism, which is an account of the strange life of Lawrence Dennis, born a Negro in Jim Crow Atlanta in the 1890s. But he was quite light-skinned and as a young adult decided to, quote, pass for white, quote, and arose to become the intellectual leader of U.S. fascism by the 1930s, huddling with Mussolini in Rome and Hitler in Berlin, and slated to rule the United States if World War II had gone in a different direction. Roger Guinevere Smith, if you are listening, this project is a natural for you. For those seeking to understand how and why this nation supposedly had a grand revolution in 1776, but faces the prospect of fascism within months or a few years, pick up a copy of my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. It has long been known that Black folk did not, in the main, support the revolt against London's rule, which has led to continuing persecution of us unremittingly, and with persecution of us still on the agenda through these camouflage buzzwords and acronyms of anti-wokeness and anti-CRT and anti-DEI. For those seeking a deep dive into Black LA history, pick up my book, Fire This Time, Watch Uprising in the 1960s, which also includes a coda on the 1992 revolt, spurred by acquittal of the officers of the law caught on tape beating mercilessly Black motorist Rodney King. For those seeking to understand Black-Brown relations, pick up a copy of my book, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. For those looking for a book to inspire your daughters and mothers and aunts or loved ones, pick up my biography of Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois, perhaps the leading Black woman intellectual and activist ever, though her life has been overshadowed by the towering intellectual activist that was her spouse, W.E.B. Du Bois. Sports fans should pick up my book, The Bittersweet Science, Racism and the Political Economy of Boxing, where you will find new detail about the lives and careers of Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson and Jack Johnson, and as well find a bookend to the feminism of Graham Du Bois with the stirring account of the promise and perils of masculinity. Those simply looking to be inspired by accounts of revolutionary struggle, pick up my books on the Haitian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution. In other words, whoever you are or might want to become, we will have a book for your perusal, ready to inspire and or to be inscribed as a gift to a loved one. Run, don't walk, to Africa Town Park, Saturday, February 3rd, 2024, 1 to 3 p.m. Details at kpfk.org or my Facebook page. All, and I do mean all, proceeds going to your favorite radio station, kpfk.org. Be there or be square. This has been Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
1/3 of the Gaza population of 1,700,000 have been displaced. There is no electricity, no running water, and the law of warfare has been violated. These are war criminals.
Free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said, free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said, free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said, free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. 1948, they invaded a nation. Occupation of Palestine for gains and corporation. Kids and family getting killed every day. Wouldn't our humanity go for the human race? We're too busy working for the devil, funding atrocities for the money. Funny how the media, which is filled with lies, keeping silence of all these war crimes. Listen up, can I tell you this? If they went to your house and did what they did, what would you do? Speaking some truth, strip you from your freedom, drone flying over you, any day you could die. Your mama cried, you seen your sister buried alive, bombs in the sky, unjustified homicide, modern day genocide, will falsify with the pretext to occupy. Now don't get me wrong, I ain't a preacher, but ring the alarm, United Nations. Working with Satan, demonstrations in every country, we're running out of patience. Raising a kid in this warlike spot, and of course the kids are growing up, won't look up to Hamas. No jobs, no money, and nothing else to do. Revolution is on, so spread the truth in this capitalistic new world agenda. But stealing people's land, can you remember what they did to Ramallah and the West Bank? White, black, and brown, united we stand, divided we fall to the settlers' wall. Separation barriers, it's the time of the jaw. Revolve, when man loses his sanity. Free Palestine, and now they wanna ban me. Free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said, free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said, free Gaza, free Palestine. Somebody gotta deal with these war crimes. Said.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And up next are prison radio commentaries.
For Bob Wells, Presente. For Bob Wells, a life lived long was a life lived well. For he wore many hats: organizer, anti-racist activist, supporter and worker with the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee in Chicago, teacher, investigative reporter, magazine editor, seaman, hotel and restaurant cook, and banquet chef. He was a key activist in anti-prison and abolitionist work with the Labor Action Committee in San Francisco, and finally, a self-defense instructor. But if you really wanted to know Bob Wells, all you had to do was read him. Inspired by the classic works of Mark Twain, Bob Wells wrote of Huckleberry Finn and fugitive slave Jim, who both met up with John Brown and his fellow abolitionist fighters before the coming of the U.S. Civil War. If you haven't already done so, I urge you all to read the book entitled Passing Through to the Territory by Robert Wells. His work is a wonderful piece of work, a novel of historical fiction of what might have been. On every page is Bob's fine and rich anti-racist imagination. 2 years ago, unfortunately, Bob had a stroke. And today, he is no longer with us. He is with his ancestors. But we remember him through his work, his wisdom, and his fight for labor and the oppressed. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Hi, my name is Crystal Denise Clark. My MA number is 435064. I'm in WAZ, the Valley of Death. Still haven't got no help. Still haven't went to the heart specialist. It's like my body is like declining. It's not doing good. My heart not doing good. My chest, I've been telling them I'm bringing up blood. I'm having these real bad nosebleeds. My eyesight, I'm really scared. My ears is so bad, y'all. It's so bad. And I'm begging them to send me to the hospital. My body should not be swollen like this and staying swollen like this. I'm begging them and telling them it's something that's not right. It's something not right. Why y'all not listening to me? It's their fault. They don't want to send me to the hospital because they know the hospital gonna show what's going on, and they in here trying to act like there's nothing wrong when you can see it all on my body. You can see how my body is how I'm looking. I'm tired. I'm tired of laying in this bed that I barely sometimes can't even get out the bed. My bunkie had to help me. This is unstoppable. Just sound and ringing, I'm hitting my ears. How bad my ears is swollen and they infected. You can see the stuff in there. And nothing is being done at all. Nothing. They ain't giving me no antibiotics, no ear drops. They won't give me nothing. They trying to act like I'm just normal. And then I went to see the mental health doctor. Like, I'm like, is you here to help me or are you here to make it seem like I'm crazy? Because ain't nothing crazy about me. Y'all have been in black and white with every medical and every blood, everything y'all took, it came back that something is wrong. She's like, oh, where's your body high? Trying to give me some psych medication. I'm like, I don't need no psych medication. I need to get to a hospital. Like, I need to get to a hospital. They trying to dope me up on psych medication like I'm crazy. This is unacceptable what they are doing here. I said, and she seen this. She said, oh, you swollen, your face. She seen everything. But you want to give me some psych medication that made me like a zombie around here like everybody else, and and make me sleepy so I won't think. This is sickness. Like, should know what had to go through this. We matter. I matter. Should know what had to be treated like this to go through this. And they know I'm speaking out about it, so they keep on like acting like, oh, like it's a mental. Ain't nothing. Y'all wasn't playing on my mental. Y'all neglecting me. Y'all been neglecting me for too long. I've been telling them about this mold and how it's affecting me. And now you got proof, and now you got medical records, and you still don't do nothing. The doctor can sit in your face and smile and cover your help up and not do anything. Nodules, they are growing in my throat. You can see them moving where I talk. They so swole. They are growing. Still having no follow-up for that. The lumps in my chest is not in my chest, what they said. Still no follow-up for that. This got to stop what they doing to me. I need to get to a hospital so I can get the right help before it's too late. I'm telling y'all, whatever my body is doing is not normal. This is not right. I just want to tell y'all, I'm just grateful to have y'all in my life and y'all support. I really love all of you, and I'm praying that y'all can stay by our side and fight with us through this. Fight with us and don't give up on us, because we need y'all. My name is Crystal Denise Clark. My MA number is 435064. I'm in WAZ, the Valley of Death.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Anne Pollock, Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London, UK, and author of the book Sickening: Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Professor Pollock.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So why did you write this book, Sickening?
Well, so thank you so much for reaching out to me about this book, because the full title is called Sickening: Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. And it's a book that really emerged out of my teaching. I used to teach at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, classes like biomedicine and culture and science, technology, and race. And I found that the way that we were generally teaching about the impact of racism on health and actually on broader lived experience, the way that we did it historically wasn't as effective as it might be. And that often what we did, especially when I teach about history of medicine, was we would talk about the history of colonization, the history of slavery, and kind of work through chronologically. And what that did was that it made it a little bit harder for students to engage. And so what I thought I would do is write a book that took a slightly different approach. So definitely still continuing on those really important historical aspects, but by starting the story all with cases in the 21st century. So instances that students might have heard about or could in any case relate to that really help to set in the kind of current century the problems that we have in terms of how inequalities in the broader society lead to healthcare and health inequalities. And then, kind of with that looping history, make it a little bit more accessible. And I think that by trying to make the story more accessible for undergraduates, it also makes it more accessible for any interested readers, hopefully.
Now, to that end, you discuss disparate impacts and their effect on Black women. And in that context, you discuss the situation involving Serena Williams, roots in Compton, California, megastar, and her issues that she confronted when giving birth. Talk to us about both of those issues, disparate impacts concerning Black women and the situation involving Serena Williams as well.
Yeah, so that is one of the cases that I talk about in the book, which is a case that really illuminates something I think important about reproductive justice and reproductive injustice. So as folks may have remember kind of hearing about in social media, Serena Williams almost died in childbirth. So she was having complications that are related to a blood clotting disorder that she has. She knew that she was having this problem because obviously she's someone who is highly aware of her body and well positioned to advocate for herself. And yet she really struggled to be listened to by the medical professionals who were taking care of her. And I think that what this case does is kind of illustrate a lot of the problems with the conventional explanations for why Black women have such worse maternal health outcomes than white women in the US. Because there tends to be this kind of rush to say, oh, well, maybe it's about education, or maybe it's about access to healthcare, or maybe it's about insurance, or maybe it's about something else, right? Rather than recognizing that discrimination within the healthcare system itself can and does contribute to poorer health outcomes. And so I think that this really is one of the key things that, especially for pre-medical students and for people who are involved with the medical system, but for everybody, to really move away from trying to blame the people who are suffering from poor health outcomes, trying to kind of find some ways to explain away those health outcomes, and instead look at the ways that our healthcare institutions and our broader society are contributing to those.
Now, you mentioned with regard to Serena Williams that the issue involved the question of childbirth, and you also mentioned the high rate of infant mortality amongst Black women. Fold that into a larger discussion about health disparities and how they impact Black children and Black infants.
Yeah, it's such an important question. So, we know that the stresses that are in the kind of whole broader social condition do impact both pregnant women and then, of course, children who are born as well. And so there's a lot, that I go into a few of the ideas around this kind of theory that's called weathering. The idea that the kind of experiences of living in a racist society contribute to weathering of women's bodies so that it's almost as if the health outcomes would be what you would expect for a much older person. And so that this is maybe one reason why class and education are not as protective as we might expect for Black mothers, which is to say that older Black mothers with more educated Black mothers have even larger disparities relative to younger ones. But we can also think about it in terms of kind of premature aging or accelerated aging is what Dr. Kamara Jones talks about it as. There's a bunch of different ways of kind of theorizing that, but I think that what it speaks to is part of a broader need to listen to Black women about what's going on with their bodies in the clinical encounter. So when a doctor is talking to a pregnant woman about some concerning events, but also, a much kind of a broader sense of how our kind of lived experience, the bodies that we live in are not kind of separate from the social environment in which we live. And so the stress that we live under can and does get under the skin in ways that negatively impact the health both of women and of babies.
Now, speaking of getting under the skin, are there any particular health disparities afflicting Black boys and men?
Yes, so I think, it's perhaps it's important to say, actually, with regard to any kind of metric, that it's never binary, right? So we don't see things that are only in men, but we do see health issues that are particularly accentuated in Black men. So especially around the impacts of high blood pressure, that is, again, another one of these kind of health conditions that we see strong relationships with the stress of living in an unequal society, impacting high blood pressure, which then can also lead to all sorts of other effects. So whether that's problems with kidneys, stroke risk, and risks of heart failure, and so on. So I think that it's it's kind of one of these things where you see it's harder to maybe draw the dots, because you have to follow the risk factors to the negative effects. I guess one other thing, though, that is worth noting is the impacts of police brutality and of mass incarceration are, of course, also disproportionately impacting Black men. And so those, I think, are also particularly important to kind of be attuned to. So recognizing the ways that these systems of organizing lots of large groups of people and constructing access to health and healthcare, but also to other aspects of life that can lead to flourishing, those get very segregated, and incarceration and policing are really important in understanding the impact that has on Black men.
Now let's turn to the Black working class. So what does your book tell us about the situation involving postal workers in particular?
Yeah, so that's actually where my book started. I started my PhD, and so I was studying science, technology, and society, so trying to understand how science and technology shape society and culture, and then also how society and culture shape science and technology. I started that in 2001, and so one of the events that I really, kind of starkly remember from that period is one that's been largely forgotten, which is that in the kind of immediate wake of September 11th, 2001, there were these anthrax attacks in which anthrax was sent through the mail. And this was weaponized anthrax. We still don't know exactly who did it. It's kind of a contested question. But we do know what the impacts were, which is that Capitol Hill and then the major media outlets to whom these letters were sent were treated really seriously. So, they shut down the Capitol, did thorough cleaning, gave folks prophylactic medicines. And yet when postal workers raised their concerns about the risk that they faced, because this weaponized anthrax was, we knew, transmissible through the air, and they were using these kind of pressured air systems in the postal sorting system. And so the postal workers had every reason to believe that they would be in danger, and yet their concerns were dismissed. And the first chapter of the book opens with the 911 call of one of the postal workers, which was recorded just hours before he died. And he described his efforts both to find out more information from his employers at the Postal Service, and also his efforts to try to get healthcare, right? So going to the doctor and saying that he worked at this at this postal facility, believed he had been exposed to anthrax, and yet his concerns were dismissed. And so I think that this is a really kind of stark example for me, and in a way is a precursor to the videos that we would come to associate with Black Lives Matter, where we already know the tragic outcome of the video as we're watching it. And for me, this 911 call is kind of an earlier example of that. And so we're hearing an account in his own words of his ultimately failed effort to try to get adequate information from his employers and adequate care from his healthcare providers.
So who is Ruha Benjamin, and how does her work dovetail with yours?
Yeah, so Ruha is actually someone Ruha Benjamin is a professor of Africana Studies at Princeton University. And she and I have known each other since we were PhD students. She was at Berkeley and I was at MIT, but we connected at conferences and the like. And I think she's just one of the most important people for really thinking through the problem of, what's wrong with the fact that so many public health folks, bioethics folks, sociologists of medicine, and so on, emphasize this idea of African American distrust as something that contributes to poor health outcomes. So what Ruha Benjamin argues is that actually we don't need to kind of only look to the very true situations. I mean, we do know that there is distrust and that it is rooted in part in historical events. So the Tuskegee syphilis study being famous, of course, abuses in slavery also, the Gila cell line. I mean, there's many examples. But yeah, what she argues, and I think what is so important in understanding contemporary situation today, is that it's not only historic injustices that cultivate this distrust, but contemporary situations. So everyday experiences of, being inadequately cared for, being distrusted, the whole, kind of not just within healthcare, but within housing and with so many different kind of institutions, education, policing, and so on. Really, we need to not worry so much about the distrust that members of racialized groups experience, but rather on the untrustworthiness of the institutions. And that's where the bioethicists should focus. That's where the sociologists should focus. That's where all of us, who really want to change this system should focus, is saying, okay, how do we make it so that the systems are set up in ways that are accountable, and then the patients will trust, right? So so if we focus on making sure that institutions are trustworthy, then yeah, the kind of problem of distrust will solve itself. And there are many more ways too that Ruha has been really influential in my work. I mean, I think everyone should definitely read her books. So including her first one, which is where she started talking about this, which is called People Science, about sickle cell anemia clinic and these ideas about embryonic stem cell research in California, kind of in the early 2000s. But then also her more recent work, including she has a great memoir come manifesto called Viral Justice, and really great kind of scholarship and kind of poetics as well there.
Mm-hmm. So what is media analysis and how does it fit into your book?
Yeah, so I think, the media is just really important to engage with. I've already mentioned one example, right? So this kind of 911 call that I heard about. But I think that what this, what a lot of us are kind of navigating this social media kind of doom scroll. And, it's really important to know what's going on, right? I mean, we absolutely don't have an alternative to that. And yet I think that it is also so important not to be defeated by that doom scroll. So not to just kind of say, oh, okay, here's another example of something horrible happening in the world, and here's another one, and here's another one, but actually look, kind of step back, look at the narratives, how they're operating, how they fit into broader context. And I think that can actually make that engagement with media feel much less incapacitating, and instead be really, it can actually feel empowering, right? Once you start to see, okay, here are these media narratives and here's how they operate. So one example, for example, that I talk about in the book that was actually a useful kind of conversation of being here in the UK as I was finishing the editing was that this idea of the people who were the survivors of Hurricane Katrina, who were referred to as refugees. And one of my colleagues here, a Belgian woman, was like, well, why are you calling them refugees? I mean, they're from the United States and they're in the United States. And these kinds of framings actually are really important to stop and ask ourselves those questions, right? Like, what work does that do to use the language that we typically would use across national borders within the United States? And it's a really good kind of signal for thinking about, okay, what is going on with citizenship? Are the people who were left behind by their government in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, to what extent are they understood as citizens, and what needs to change such that everyone is, of course, considered to be a full and equal citizen?
Finally, Professor Pollock of King's College London, UK, author of the book Sickening. What about the role of Big Pharma in your story?
Yeah, Big Pharma appears quite a bit. I mean, so partly this comes up right from the beginning. So with the postal workers who died of anthrax, so they were not provided with Cipro, which was the kind of antibiotic of that was appropriate for that. And I was really struck at the time that many people did have access to these life-saving drugs, but not everyone, and that those kind of access to medicines really followed along racialized as well as class lines. And that's something that kind of continues throughout. So with Katrina, as I mentioned, I became really interested in the way that there was an increase in heart attacks and other kind of events well after the storm. And a lot of that turns out to be around access to medicines also. After Hurricane Katrina, Big Pharma did participate in kind of donation programs of pharmaceuticals, but not necessarily the ones that were most needed. So they had lots of drugs that would address infectious disease if there was a waterborne outbreak, but not the drugs for diabetes, for heart failure, for high blood pressure, for all of the things that were really the main things that the people who were impacted most needed. And I think again and again, we see this happen where we have a misalignment between the priorities of Big Pharma and the priorities of health. And so this is something that we, I think, need to constantly contest, right? So there's actually a lot of public investment that goes into both pharmaceutical research and the provision of pharmaceuticals. And so it's up to all of us to advocate for those benefits to be actually authentically and democratically shared.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Pollock, author of the book Sickening, Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks so much for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Elisabeth Armstrong, Dr. Anne Pollock. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. This program, as well as prior programs, can be reheard for the next 60 days. You can go to kpfk.org, audio archives, scroll to Freedom Now. Stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.